improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Everyone, welcome to another edition of the Carry On Podcast, SITREP edition. Thanksgiving week. To everyone out there who's watching or listening, happy Thanksgiving. This happens to be my absolute favorite time of the year. I love nothing more than cooking for other people, inviting friends and family into the home, and really having a non-commercialized family gathering. It is one of my favorite moments of the year. So to that end, we've taken a couple of weeks off. So if you are wondering where I have been these last 2 weeks, fear not, alive and well, much to the chagrin of my enemies and much to the pleasure of those who appreciate listening to this wonderful podcast. And as far as appreciation goes, I want to give a special thank you to our sponsors. The Patreon is live, and behind it is some special content that we have reserved for you and you alone. We have some interesting discussions with some folks over whiskeys where we talk about whiskeys, tell some war stories, and that is a benefit of the Patreon members only. So just wanted to plug that in. Let's get into it for the week of Thanksgiving, and we'll talk a little bit about some stories that had preceded that as well. Right off the bat, let's talk a little bit about Venezuela and the Caribbean and this counter-narcotics push that the administration has had. Heretofore, we've had about 80 strikes. Actually, let me correct that. 21 strikes, about 80 fatalities recorded so far on alleged drug boats coming out of Venezuela. Now, the administration has couched these as being under the guise of Maduro, and they have gone so far as to designate the cartel de los Soles. I apologize. I don't habla Espanol very well. If I mispronounced that, my apologies. They have designated that cartel as a foreign terrorist organization, and an FTO organization, or an FTO designation allows the administration to undergo more direct military strikes, a little more aggressive military options, sanctions, of course. It is interesting that there is an entire carrier strike group in that part of the world right now. Multiple warships, F-35s, nuclear-powered submarines, and all of this under the guise of narcotics, counter-narcotics. It's a little weird. I was trying to think back towards the Reagan administration and Nancy Reagan's big war on drugs, and I don't ever remember a carrier strike group being part of it. Al Jazeera is reporting that the focus on counter-narcotics has allowed the FAA warnings to airlines about potentially hazardous airspace, and the scale of the naval deployments is recorded as one of the largest in decades. I also have been reading some reporting from the National Security News, which gives a much more blunt take on it, that it is clearing a legal path for direct attack on Venezuela, potentially speculating about land strikes to target Maduro himself. This is unprecedented, and there's a lot of things that have been happening in the world lately where I've been labeling unprecedented. Conflict and war, nothing new about that. We've been doing it for the last 3,000 years of recorded history. What is new is blending this legal and military infrastructure for a real war with Venezuela being built in plain sight, even if the White House is talking about it under the drugs and law enforcement banner. It is clearly not. I am very interested to see where this is going to escalate next. And if we do, in fact, conduct strikes in Venezuela's sovereign territory, not just in its in the waterways and international waterways. So, yeah, more to follow. In other news, we had some Democratic lawmakers make a video reminding the armed forces not to follow any unlawful orders. And the administration either misheard or misunderstood the message that those Democratic senators were making as seditious behavior punishable by death. They were not directing the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to disobey lawful orders. They were simply reminding active duty forces not to follow unlawful orders. And of course, the Trump administration with Pete Hegseth in the lead reacted pretty strongly. I think they're both idiots. I think both sides of this argument are complete idiots. First off, you don't need senators to remind military service members what is and is not law-abiding behavior under the guise of the UCMJ. It is not required. All entry-level recruits and commissioned officers get hours upon hours of instruction on good order and discipline and what is a lawful order and what isn't a lawful order and when you are required to follow each and what your recourse is if you don't. You, senators, are not needed to dogpile onto that. And it was petty. I thought that the justification behind it was malicious, but here you go. You poked the bear. So then Pete Hegseth tells one of the senators that they may recall them to active duty so that they can punish them under the UCMJ. Again, here's that word again, unprecedented. We are just seeing stuff happen in the military with our commander-in-chief, with our Secretary of Defense that we've never seen before. And this is absolutely one of them. Why it matters? Because we are, again, focusing on the nature of trying to prosecute a sitting senator and retired officer over speech and the chilling effect that has on the civil and military boundaries. And the real story is the administration is using military law and the threat of capital punishment to censor speech. And that's a serious erosion of the old military stays out of partisan politics line. As always, we will see what happens. My thought is that this will probably fade away in a very fast-paced news cycle. Probably not going to hear anything about this. There's no way that this senator, who is a former Navy captain, could be activated on active duty and tried under the UCMJ in a courts-martial. It's just not going to happen. Okay. Moving to the south of the border, there were a couple of contractors under direction of the U.S. Department of Defense or Department of War, I never know, who were placing signs down in a Mexican beach, likely Playa Baghdad, that essentially said restricted area of the Department of Defense, and it's a national defense area. The Mexican military quickly removed the signs, and the president of Mexico, Sheinbaum, she is saying that she is going to file a complaint against the International Boundary and Water Commission to rule on whether this violated the 1970 Boundary Treaty. And a lot of experts think that it did. But see, here's the thing, is that we are, this is a slippery slope here. We are entitled to have a military exclusion zone within and around our borders. And it can ebb and flow within, certain limitations. The national defense areas, they can be stretched. So the administration admittedly, or at least the Department of Defense admittedly, said this was a mistake. These signs were put up in the wrong area. There was confusion about where the boundary was. They said that they would coordinate better. But they also confirmed the existence of large national defense areas around the border. Trump created those with a memorandum. If you layer this over a broader executive built drive towards buildup of U.S. military zones on the border, this is not surprising. Threats on U.S. strikes on cartels in Mexico has been stated. There's a lot of back and forth between Trump and Sheinbaum over intervention. I have said personally, I think it would be a massive giggle fest to unleash the entire SOCOM with all of its supporting infrastructure into the Mexico drug cartel space. I think it would be hilarious to watch. I would buy pay-per-view tickets to that because SOCOM would kick the ever-loving shit out of the cartels. Unfortunately, that takes care of Mexico. You have the entire China problem to deal with after that. So the takeaway here is that the line between domestic law enforcement and overt military operations at and beyond the border, it's being deliberately blurred. And Mexico is pushing back with treaties and a lot of bluster, to be perfectly honest, because they're not going to push the United States around no matter how much they may be in the right and how much we might be in the wrong. I don't have a lot of tolerance for this sort of thing in the sense that As far as I'm concerned, Mexico needs to police its shit a little bit better. So this story for me is kind of a nothing burger, but interesting. Nigeria. Oh, wow. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Nigeria because it has been busy. And we are going to talk about the kidnappings. We're going to circle back and do a little bit of a deeper dive into that in the end. But I wanted to get the broad strokes of a couple of things. So Trump has said publicly that there could be, emphasis on the could, U.S. troops or airstrikes in Nigeria to stop the killing of Christians. And we talked about this in a previous episode about the footprint that Christians have in that part of the world and whether or not they are in fact being deliberately targeted. Now, Trump has re-added Nigeria to the countries of particular concern list in response to not just this incident, but a lot of previous incidents. And as I said in an earlier episode, I'm left wondering why. Who whispered into his ear? Why now? There's a lot of humanitarian crises that are taking place. There's a lot of sectarian violence. There's a lot of religious persecution all over the world. It's interesting. I don't want to rehash that. It's already been said. So let's talk about topical. It's not a formal deployment order, but it does make headlines and it does put pressure on Nigeria to do a little bit better job. Remember that meanwhile in the Middle East, we have about 40,000 troops stationed around the Middle East in Iran, Israel, conducting operations against the Houthi rebels and against Hezbollah. And so you have a very large standing Middle East posture, a rapidly escalating Caribbean and Venezuelan posture, and then open talks of actions in Nigeria. And creeping operational creep in Mexico, as I just said, that's a lot of simultaneous flashpoints for even one force, even with recruiting up, which we're also going to talk about here shortly. So this is another interesting modernization story that I came across. There is going to be the installation in 2028 of a micro-reactor. So we're talking about 1 to 20 megawatts of power. It'll be on a U.S. military base. It's called the Janus program, and it is designed to provide advanced nuclear power for bases, networks, off-grid weapon systems. And this is a huge boon to the private sector who is generating these devices and the infrastructure that helps connect them to the grid. In many ways, this is a wonderful melding of personal business capital and governmental enterprise to solve a long-term problem. This is not a tomorrow morning story. We're talking about locking in a hardened, expeditionary, energy-independent force posture for the next decade. If you have these micro-reactors hardened at military installations, they're not susceptible to foreign manipulation of our power grid. Looking at you, China. This would future-proof in many ways our energy supply, and the industry that's manufacturing these is looking at them with a very keen eye, because as a proof of concept, you can provide a micro-reactor on a military installation, providing clean, sustainable power, then you can do it for all of these AI data centers that are going to be cropping up. Remember, massive amounts of power for remote communications, data centers, and ports. And there's no good energy solution for those. So companies like Radiant and Oklo and Antares, who are making these microreactors and trying them out, are very excited about the opportunity for a contract with the U.S. government to supply these microreactors. In other news overseas, somewhat in the same vein, Navy SATCOM, the Navy just approved a $200 million sale of a Navy multi-band terminals kit to the United Kingdom, and that's just to help shore up their maritime communications and interoperability. I am really excited about this because one of the things that I have said time and time again is the United States has a massive technological edge against our near peer and peer adversaries, but that edge is shrinking. And if we don't take steps like this and these microreactors, I think we leave ourselves vulnerable, and that edge is going to erode and eventually be eclipsed. So I'm all for it. I think this is great. We talked a little bit about recruiting just a moment ago. Let's talk about it in a little more detail. So for the first time in a long time, and first time in a long time, meaning 2022 and 23, the U.S. military has not only met, but it has exceeded its recruitment goals. Fantastic news. We're talking about the Army hitting 106% of its active duty targets as of late August, and it's the strongest recruiting performance in 30 years, as reported by the Army Times. You also have 108% of the Navy recruiting goal. You have 111% of National Guard, and 100% of the Air Force and the Marine Corps. Now, the Marine Corps usually hits its recruiting goals year after year after year for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, as the smallest service, their recruitment goals are not as robust as the sister services. And also, they're the best and everybody just wants to be a Marine. I can't blame them. So it is nice to see our other services following suit. The question that is being raised, even by pro-military analysts, is how sustainable this is going to be if the ops tempo and political climate keep increasing and heating up. And there are a lot of it. This next story, it's not as sexy as some of the other stories, but in the broader sense, it weaves nicely into the tapestry. So in the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, it's moving through both houses of Congress as we speak. And one of the sticking points is the PFAS cleanup. What is PFAS? Well, it's a firefighting foam. Aqueous film-forming foam was the last batch, and it was found to be horribly cancer-producing, so they phased it out in favor of this. But this is turning out to be not a whole lot better. So for some reason, the Senate Democrats are pushing to reverse provisions in the current draft bill that would delay phasing out of PFAS firefighting foam, cut the cleanup funding, lift bans on incinerating the laden foam, and let the military buy everyday PFAS-containing products again. And this is where support the troops meets the bill for decades of environmental damage at bases. It is especially for firefighters, nearby communities, and overseas hosts. This is an environmental issue, but it's also a policy issue. And when you talk about sustaining a military, you look at tooth to tail. The guns, the bullets, the cutting edge weaponry, I mean, they're what everybody wants to focus on. But things like aqueous foam, firefighting foam, and PFAS it's something that is also making up the overall logistical train of our forces. And it is part of the story. And a continuing part of the story is, this one blows my mind. So for those of you that were in the Boy Scouts, I was for many years. I enjoyed Scouts, and I am not going to debate the merits of modern day scouting versus the scouting that I must have been a part of in the 80s. But the military has always had a close relationship with the Boy Scouts. For example, if you are a Eagle Scout, upon enlisting, you automatically get one free rank awarded to you. You would enlist as an E2 instead of an E1. At least that was the case in the Marine Corps. Well, currently, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, is essentially attacking scouts for being genderless, too DEI focused, no longer cultivating masculine values. And to that end, they're not going to participate in the Boy Scout Jamboree. In times past, they supported it with logistics, medical support. They did some flyovers and some other static displays, and basically just encouraged that good, wholesome, interoperability. Well, that is getting pulled back. And of course, the national security exemption is going to be attempted to override DOD's decision. There's a contingent in Congress who is trying to override that decision. And I got to be honest, this one right here, I'm kind of against. I think the Boy Scouts provide valuable virtues, life-building skills, coaching, mentoring, structure, discipline, not as discipline-minded as the military, but you're talking about, people who are below the age of 18, not eligible to join the military in most cases. And this, for many of them, provides the closest that they can get. I think that it gives individuals a sense of community, a sense of self. And I don't think that disenfranchising an entire group that has been around for generations because you find them to be too woke is necessarily the most appropriate response. I think the better way is for you to become even more involved with the Scouts. If you fear the erosion of their core ethos, then inoculate them with some good old-fashioned military doctrine. How is that the antithesis of what you're trying to accomplish? But no, that's not what they're doing. They're part of the broader administrations to purge the woke decay, which I'm not against at all. We have slid a little too far in the opposite direction. Don't mind pulling it back, but focus it on the active duty service member. Don't overreach into the private sector and the Boy Scouts. So let's kind of zoom out here for a moment and take everything that I have just talked about in the broader picture, and let's see how it all ties together. So expanding legal and military scaffolding for force protection in the framework of Venezuela, Nigeria, and Mexico. Yes, we still have a very heavy Middle East presence. Again, 40,000 troops spread across different bases throughout the Middle East. 40,000 is a lot. And you back that by micro-reactors, hardened communications within the United Kingdom, and a huge recruiting resurgence. All positives there. Looking inward, you have some strife between the civil and military norms, apolitical services, which are under strain. Talk of sedition, talk of death penalties. And oh, by the way, for those of you that may not understand the nuances of this, you can't prosecute under the sedition to non-active duty military personnel. It doesn't work. It's under the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which, oh, by the way, doesn't apply to civilians, doesn't apply to those who are no longer eligible for recalling to active duty. So just wanted to throw that out there. The threats to a court-martial, to a sitting senator, it's a media-friendly soundbite, but there's no teeth behind it. Internal culture fights over who counts as the right kind of American to partner with the military. And that's talking about the Boy Scouts again. And it's just a disappointment. I think the Boy Scouts provides a valuable service that nobody else does in a world where there's less and less role models that are acceptable in the world, where it is no longer okay to be masculine or demonstrate masculine traits. The Boy Scouts is kind of that last bastion where boys can be boys, and they don't have to be watered down. So the NDAA and the PFAS fight, it just kind of shows how the long tail of health, environment, and budget trade-offs, it's lagging behind the front end push for capability and operations. And then drilling deeper, the most consequential axis right now, I think, is the Venezuelan and Caribbean with the illegal orders fight. I think that's where operational escalation and constitutional stress are intersecting. I'm drinking white whiskey today, which is an unaged, what they call white dog. It is high proof whiskey, never touched a barrel, young, like just born. Palate cleanser. Okay, let's talk in detail about what happened in Nigeria with the Catholic school being targeted by militants. So on the 21st of November, Friday, very recently, you had armed men storm a Catholic school in Nigeria, St. Mary's. It is in a remote community. It's off the beaten path. I mean, there's not a lot of things in Nigeria that are not remote, but it's being somewhat cynical. So they attack at night. They attack the sleeping section where the students were asleep. They fired shots, badly wounding a security guard, and then the gunmen forced the students and the staff out, and they marched them into a nearby bush known as bandit territory. I don't know how long they marched, and I don't know where their destination was, and I'm sure somebody does, and it's not this call sign. because some of them were able to escape. The Christian Association of Nigeria states that 303 students, roughly ages 10 to 18, with 12 teachers and staff were abducted. So something like 315 students, 315 people in total. Some students were grabbed by trying to flee, and then 88 reportedly caught during escape attempts. So this is definitely, on its face, giving credence to the belief that Christians are being targeted in this country. But hold on, there's more to the story here. Since then, around 50 students have escaped in ones and twos. That leaves something like 253 students, all 12 of the staff still in captivity. And just a quick moment on the staff. Like, dude, I'm all about escaping, but if you're the adult, you don't escape when there's still children left behind. You better be the last motherfuckers to leave. You're responsible for these people. I know it sucks, but anyways, moving on. The Nigerian police, army units, local hunters, they're looking all over the area in the Niger state, but there's been no confirmed mass rescue yet. The state governor ordered all schools in Niger closed indefinitely after the attack. Again, at first glance, it looks like here we have a targeting of Christians in that part of the country, but no group has claimed responsibility. And if nobody's claiming responsibility, then they're not doing it for ideological means. They're doing it for ransom. And if they're doing it for ransom, that's just good old-fashioned banditry. You're a pirate. You are holding people for ransom. And if they're coming from a sect of that society, which is predominantly upper class or middle class, and you are poor or no class, it just stands to reason that you're going to get kidnapped for ransom. It's not a formal jihadist group that is claiming any kind of ideological motives. And because of that, the attack is not, I don't think, eligible for that same level of pearl clutching that some of the other attacks have been. Don't get me wrong, all of this is bad, but it is not targeted against a particular religious group. It's just a target of opportunity. So it happened the same week, believe it or not, coincidentally, as the abduction of 25 Muslim schoolgirls in the Kebbi state, where a church was attacked there, worshipers were killed, and 38 were kidnapped. The president has canceled all foreign travel, including the G20 trip, promised a crackdown. Critics at home say that this is just one more example of a failure to protect rural schools and Christian people. The Pope has weighed in, bless him, calling for the immediate release, as you would expect. And the Nigerian government is pretty much feckless. So this is the deeper patterns. This is one of the worst mass school kidnappings in Nigeria since 2014. We all remember that. It has been a total of, I want to say, 1,500 students abducted in northern and central Nigeria, with quiet ransoms paid, negligible prosecutions, and then Christian groups frame it as anti-Christian terror, but a lot of independent analysts say that it's a mix. It's a mix of criminal ransom economics, it's a mix of state corruption and impunity, and a security vacuum that leaves Christian and Muslim communities exposed. This is a part of the world where there's not a lot of opportunity, and they're trying to pull themselves out of squalor, not the kidnappers, the students, both in the Muslim school and the Christian school. They're trying to provide them with education and a way up, but the government is not capable of providing fixed security. What would probably work better is cooperating with NGOs to provide private security. Look, I'm telling you, there's a lot of people globally who would be more than happy to provide physical security to these schools if you would contract them. Companies that are private contracting companies who specialize in this type of thing are out there. Nigeria. If you're not willing to step up and provide better protections, then privatize it, especially something like the Catholics, who have a lot of donators a lot of money and a lot of resources that would probably help fund this sort of thing. So if you want, the next step is to dissect whether this is really religious persecution versus opportunistic banditry, and what is implied for a U.S. military response. Because as was reported earlier, the president has not ruled out stationing troops there or conducting strikes. And we did episode on options for the military in that country, for the U.S. government in that country. Okay. A little bit more. Let's go a little bit deeper into this, because as I say, it's the intersection of genuine anti-Christian violence, opportunistic banditry, and a U.S. political narrative that just wants to label it as pure genocide. And they're labeling it that to justify intervention. And if you want to collapse it into one of those, go ahead. But I think you're being incredibly myopic. I think that let's look at it a little more. So I guess what this comes down to is it religious persecution or isn't it? And the answer is it's both. It's not ideological killing in the way that Boko Haram has done it in the past, but the largest persecution of Christians is taking place in Nigeria. It's pretty serious, but that's not what this instance is. It is classic kidnapping for ransom sometimes with impunity, but not ideological. So I would say that a lot of people are looking at this as driven by local conditions. It is a byproduct of I don't want to say a failed state, because Nigeria is not, but man, they're not exactly doing a very good job of keeping their citizens safe. And they're certainly not doing a very good job of cracking down on these terrorist organizations that are perpetrating this, or their criminal gangs that are doing it as well. So I think in that respect, the administration is well within its rights to put pressure on the Nigerian government to try and stem some of this religious violence. But they're overlapping crisis. Jihadist violence that actually does target Christians, like Muslims who oppose them, and a decentralized banditry that hits whenever and whomever it's profitable and vulnerable. It happens to oftentimes be in regions where Christians are heavily represented among those as vulnerable populations. So it's a complex issue. And I mean, strictly speaking, both sides are correct in their statements. It is targeting Christians, but it's also not. So I don't know how this one gets resolved. Hopefully the Nigerian government allows more U.S. cooperation to target these terrorist organizations that are perpetrating violence against Christians on an ideological basis, and also providing the Nigerian government with training and support to destroy these bandit groups. And then look, long term, you know what brings stability to any country is prosperity and opportunity. These bandits are probably not going to be conducting banditry. God, I love that word, by the way. If there was not a need for it, if there was not a market for it, if there was not a an environment that allows them to thrive, yeah, and in the same way that the pirates have also thrived. So how is the U.S. narrative distorting this? Well, Washington is taking a lot of pleasure with this story, saying that Christianity is facing an existential threat in Nigeria, blaming radical Islamists for a mass slaughter threatening to go in guns blazing if Nigeria doesn't protect Christians. But the U.S. is still having to respect Nigerians' sovereignty. They can't go in there without being invited. It risks a huge second and third order effect if they do. They re-added Nigeria to the country of particular concern list for religious freedom, and they're looking at sanctions, plus Pentagon options framed as protecting Christians. I don't know if we really have the bandwidth for this. With everything else that's going on in the world, do we have the bandwidth to intervene with troops on the ground in Nigeria. I mean, we certainly can supply them with intelligence, with logistical support, with a contingent of training troops, but to actually move the needle, you're going to have to put a serious footprint on the ground. And that comes with a tremendous amount of vulnerabilities and risk, both realistic military vulnerabilities and political capital vulnerabilities. I don't know. If you flatten it into a clean Christians versus Islamic killer story that plays extremely well with the U.S. domestic base, then you can definitely see the move. If you're using it to frame and justify sanctions, military planning, yeah, I get it. What would military action do? Well, you could do airstrikes on known camps where Islamists are known to be. You could use that same ISR infrastructure to target bandits, local militia, but you're going to have to accept the fact that you're probably going to hit the wrong target. You're probably going to have a lot of collateral damage, and you're not going to rescue a lot of people that way. In reality, the intelligence in these environments, it sucks. They're fluid. Groups overlap. People morph from herder to bandit to local militia and back. This is one of those asymmetrical fights that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's amorphous, and it's very hard to pin down and find, fix, and finish. And if you're not going to establish a footprint on the ground for the long haul, where's my Afghanistan flag, by the way? Then you're fucking wasting your time. There's other ways to do it aside from putting boots on the ground. Every time you go in there, as we said in the last broadcast, you feed the jihadist machine. All they do is use our strikes as our involvement as propaganda. Pull the strings from behind the scenes. You're probably going to do this by proxy anyways. You're going to get a lot better results without any of the blowback. And that's really where we're trying to avoid. And you're just going to give these groups an excuse not to fix themselves. If the cavalry is always about to arrive, why do the hard, boring things like political reform, local justice, land dispute systems, anti-corruption in the security sector? So if your internal story is sending the Americans and kids gets rescued and Christians are safe, you're selling yourself a movie, not a strategy. It's just not going to work. This is a complex issue, and I don't want to go down a rabbit hole too much, but I think a more prioritized approach is probably better here. If the goal is fewer Papiri-type attacks and fewer Christian and Muslims really murdered, then the levers that actually matter are more like target the money in the logistics, not the gunmen. Somebody's paying, the money's going somewhere. Sanctions on specific Nigerian elites, military officers, and local politicians credibly linked to bandit networks will go a lot farther. Financial intelligence on the ransom flows, who's paying the money, where is it matriculating to? Look, money has to flow through some type of chain. I mean, yeah, you could do cattle, you could pay them in gold and arms, but all of these things have to come from and flow to someone and somewhere, and it's traceable. The U.S. is really good at intelligence collection, not necessarily as great as aggregating. But if we wanted to find the dots and then connect them, we could absolutely do it. And I think that's a vector that should seriously be explored. Tie all of the U.S. and EU assistance to real conditionality. So no toys without prosecutions. Stop giving military assistance to the Nigerian government unless they have a demonstrable record of prosecuting some of these people that are brought to justice. No intel sharing without verified changes in how operations are conducted in some of these rural areas. You have to also back Nigerian civil actors who are actually in the line of fire. So the Christian and Muslim organizations who do local mediation, they document attacks, and they push for accountability, you have to support them. You have to support trauma care, displaced families, and school hardening, as I said, that doesn't turn classrooms into barracks. Finally, Use Christian persecution narrative surgically, not as a crusade. The world bristled when Bush said that this was a crusade. Remember that back in 2003? That is not how you want to frame this. You want to frame this as Christians are being persecuted. Use it sparingly, judiciously, and don't make that your war cry every time one of these happens. Use it to get Washington and Brussels to stop ignoring Nigeria. Got it. But don't let it become the only story. You need the land, you need the climate, you need the governments, and the banditry story in the same breath, or you're lying about it. Military force, last mile. It should not be our first impulse. I think that very narrow, very targeted, ideally mutual, multilateral operations only when the intel is tight and Nigerian consent is real works. And if those conditions aren't met, you're not rescuing any kids. We've got a lot of great tier one assets that can go in and find these people, but there's so much more that has to happen in the buildup to something like that. So this story is just, it's complex and it's big. This is a ransom for hire. It happens to hit a Catholic school in a country where Christians are under serious threat. And I think that turning it into a clean Islamic genocide of Christians is politically useful in the US and emotionally satisfying, but it's analytically dishonest. And it's a bad basis for war planning. So if you want to think like a strategist here and not a spectator, you focus on net violence reduction, not moral theater. And that pushes you towards a slow, structural lever and very cautious use of force. And if you tell me what you are actually leaning towards, cheering intervention, opposing it, or just trying to understand, I can walk you through the second order effects of that as well. But I think that's enough for tonight, at least on that Nigerian topic. I want to leave us with one thing. And it's one thing that is really sticking in my craw. And that is this contrived, forced, dishonorable peace agreement that is currently being pushed and brokered between, yeah, you know it, Russia and Ukraine. I don't want hostilities in between these two countries to continue in perpetuity. But I'll tell you what's even worse, and that's a shameful peace, which is what I feel is taking place currently between these two governments, brokered by ours. If this goes to the mat and we walk away with everything that is being discussed, you may as well give the entirety of Ukraine to Putin because he's fucking won. You're going to recognize Crimea. You're going to grant territory currently held by Russia, but also on the precipice of being held to the Russians. You're going to basically give 1/3 of the entire country over to Russia and then guarantee that you neuter Ukraine forever. Never joining NATO, cap on military troops, limited foreign military sales. What the fuck is left? If I was Zelensky, and he's in a tough spot, make no bones about it, I'd give everybody the middle finger and I'd fight to the last man. The thing about it is that you make them fight until there's just no honor left. And the Russian government is the most honorless government on the planet. They don't give a fuck. They will manipulate the truth to serve their ends. And the rest of the world either accepts their narrative or doesn't, but who cares? They're going to get their way at the end of the day. I think this is a disgraceful arbitration. I think that, unfortunately, Zelensky knows that he is not running out of military support. He's not running out of political support. But you know what he is running out of? People to fight the war. Eventually, because this is a war of attrition, the Ukrainians are going to be attrited to the point of no return. But if that's the alternative, this peace agreement, I don't know, man. I may adopt a scorched earth policy and say, fuck it, bring it on. I'll die to the last man. It seems extreme, but I don't know if I would necessarily be able to look at myself in the mirror knowing that you gave away all that blood and treasure to end up with this. Is there a real solution to the success of the Ukrainian people in recovering its terrain? Not unless somebody pours some serious resources into the equation. I think the United States and its Western allies have been basically keeping this war on life support for the last 2 years. Without our weapons, long-term and short-term range, intelligence, and really shells, the war would have been over 2 years ago. The Ukrainians have shown remarkable resilience. Drone attacks, long-range excursions into Russian-held territory, even capturing a border town. Tremendous morale capital, but strategically, very little impact. For the Ukrainians to win, they have to make strategic gains. And that's going to be extraordinarily difficult with the resources at their disposal and the manpower at their disposal. You need to neuter the Russian supply lines, their logistical train, their war machine, like the earlier stages of the war had accomplished. Now in 2025, what little strategic gains that they get are immediately overshadowed by Russians' tactical push day after day after day into Russian territory. All that to say, I'm extraordinarily disheartened to see that this is even up for negotiation. Zelensky is in a tough spot. He may not have a choice. He's looking at yet another winter where the Russians are going to target Ukrainian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, gas and oil pipelines, driving the Ukrainians into a continual cycle of misery to try and get them to capitulate. As a spectator to this whole endeavor, I have the luxury of sitting back and Monday morning quarterbacking this. I'm not sleeping in a foxhole in the middle of a frozen Ukrainian tundra. I admit that. Now, I've slept in a few shitty places in my life, and I've been in some firefights, and I think I have an understanding, at least at the most basic of level, of what they're going through. But I'm sitting here thousands of miles away, calmly discussing the outcome. So it may be very different in the moment for them, as I'm sure it most definitely is. But fuck me, as a spectator, if you need a couple bucks and a couple cases of ammo to keep going for another day, bro, I'll mail it to you. And on that somber bombshell, as always, I am the Iceman, Brad Colbert. Once again, wishing everyone a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you like what you hear and you want to hear more of it, by all means, like and subscribe. And if you'd like access to content that only our supporters get, then feel free to join a Patreon at whatever tier level you would care for. Until next time, stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and